to the basics of right triangle trigonometry, specifically what sine, cosine, and tangent are. So we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the background of where all this comes from really quickly. All right, so in right triangle trigonometry, if we go back to talking about our little exploration that we did with Geometry Sketchpad, I want you to remind you that if we change the size of a triangle and the angles are staying the same but the side lengths are changing, we noticed that the ratios don't change, right? The side opposite of this angle G divided by the hypotenuse, the length of the hypotenuse, gives you 0.54 no matter what. And this was really an important breakthrough because the ancients figured out how to use this information. So if you look down at this trig table, if you see 33 degrees, we have 0.5446. What they did is they kept track of these numbers. And the way that they used it was, let's say for example, you have some sort of measurement you have to make, and there's this pesky lake in the way. So let's say you have to know the distance from H to I. And all you knew, you could measure HG and you can measure this angle. Well, what that allowed them to do is they knew that whatever IH divided by HG was, it would have to equal 0.65. Right, the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. It would have to equal 0.65. So if they knew that HG was 5.08 centimeters, then they can use a simple equation to figure out the length for IH. And they would, by using 0.65, they would figure out that IH was 3.30. And that's basically how all this began. So expanding from that, they decided to come up with names for these special ratios. And so let's talk about the names. First we'll talk about sine. So here you'll see that if I call this angle down here angle A, I have to locate the sides in relation to this angle. So the side that's opposite, the furthest side away from angle A, we call the opposite. The hypotenuse is always the longest side. Now cosine we call, if this is angle A, this side is called the adjacent side. The two sides that make angle A are made up of the hypotenuse, which is always the longest side. The other side we call it the adjacent. Okay, so cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And finally, the tangent. If this is our angle, and this is another different notation, this little funny zero with a line in it is a Greek letter called theta, and a lot of times we use theta as a variable for an angle. Just like we use x in an equation, we use theta for an angle. So theta, this here is just a variable for this angle. So angle theta, well, what's the side that's opposite of angle theta? This is the opposite side, this is the adjacent side, this is the hypotenuse, and so tangent would be the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. So here's all of them together. Again, here's your angle theta. So sine, cosine, and tangent are always in relation to an angle. So in this particular case, if this is our angle, then the sine is the side that's opposite of that angle divided by the hypotenuse. Cosine is the side adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, and here you see the tangent. Okay, so how do you remember these ratios? How do you know that the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse? Well, that's where this mnemonic comes from, so ka toa. So the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse, tangent is the opposite over the adjacent. And so that's how you're supposed to remember these trig ratios. In our next lesson, we'll talk about how to use them a little bit more in depth.